Yeah, okay, thanks a million, Paul. You can hear me there? Yeah, everybody can hear me. Okay, so we're all trying to squeeze in our great work into 10 minutes, so I'm not going to take any time whatsoever. I'll just introduce the speakers. We'll have 15 minutes each, and I'll allow the speakers to really decide how much they'll leave for Q&A. I'll give you a 10-minute call. I'll say 2 minutes, but it really means 5 minutes, okay? So today we're starting with, the name of the session today is Care and the Welfare State, and we're starting with Miss Michelle Hannon, and she is going to present to us her findings from Proposed New Family Leave Policy, a National Two-Pronged Approach, Attraction and Retention of Family Caregivers in Irish Workplaces, and a practical solution to Ireland's impending care crisis. So very important stuff. All right. Whenever you're ready, Michelle, you can go ahead.
Certainly. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here today presenting at the Nevin Economic Research Institute 8th Annual Labour Market Conference. I would like to thank firstly the organisers and all in attendance today. My name is Michelle Hannon, and this research paper was conducted in 2019 in a very different world as part of a BA Honours in Business Enterprise Leadership and Management through the Athlone Institute of Technology, under the supervision and excellent tuition of all at Equal Ireland, particularly Nuala Kerr, Ivan McPhillips and Eilish Dillon. This research is a proposal for a new family leave policy. That's a 3 to 5 day specific paid care leave to act as attraction and retention tools for employers around family caregivers at the workplace, and to assist family caregivers at work, and also to act as a practical part solution to Ireland's impending care crisis. I'm particularly passionate about this topic through personal experience of providing care over a 10-year period for my dad, who suffered from a degenerative illness while I also worked full-time. The findings of this research can assist in raising awareness of the existence, scope, scale, and issues of caregivers in our Irish workplaces today. Findings can be added to existing and future research on this extremely important issue, exploring solutions to help retain and better support this growing legion of individuals providing this vital service, working across all sectors and industries of the Irish economy. The strategy and methodology included a questionnaire completed by 23 family caregivers, also in outside employment, as well as face-to-face interviews with 3 caregivers from private, public, and community and voluntary organisations, also known as third sector organisations. Detailed review of records and documents, reports and papers were also conducted. So the introduction and aims. The study explored the opinions of caregivers on a proposed 3 to 5 day specific care leave policy, with Ireland at that particular point experiencing near full employment levels. An investigation was conducted on whether the introduction of this policy could act as an attraction and retention tool for employers, being conscious of the growing numbers of caregivers nationally. The Irish healthcare services are under increasing pressure due to the exponential growth in the older members of society and in children with additional needs, particularly those on the autism spectrum. Would the introduction of the 3 to 5 day proposed policy help lessen the strain on the creaking health service? The objectives of this research were to explore current caregiver supports, to identify actual and perceived workplace barriers, to explore current sick leave policies, whether the sick leave and employment were either paid or unpaid, and whether this particular leave was being used to care in the absence of alternative options, to examine our generous parental leave policies. Could this perhaps be reimagined to include children looking after parents at end of life? And finally, to inform policy on the findings. A work-life balance directive was adopted by the European Council in June 2019. This will be enacted into law in 2022, and carers and employers should be fully informed of the content of this directive prior to its enactment. So what is a family caregiver? Who cares? A family caregiver is someone providing an ongoing, significant level of care to a person who is in need of that care in the home due to illness, disability, or frailty. Over 355,000 people in Ireland are family caregivers, and 210,000 of these are also in full-time employment. Research has demonstrated that there are higher absentee levels or particularly premature leavers in employment from this cohort, which is providing costly for both the employees themselves, their employers, and the economy at large. So the literature review and the primary issues that presented in this were projected rapid population growth and increased health and social care demands up to 2030. Introducing 3 to 5 days specific paid carers leave to offer workers more flexibility, enabling continued high levels of labour force participation, and to assist seniors to remain at home, reducing health system burden. There is a shift away from institutional care and increased emphasis on home-based care. Women are more likely to provide informal care at all life stages, particularly women of working age. This then creates a double burden for women. Family Carers Ireland Awareness Initiative, Caring Employers, Future-Proofing Your Workforce. This would be a value add for both parties in that it will attract and retain talent, and it's more caring for the employees. Home care structures being diluted and decimated, with 78,000 more women engaged in employment in Ireland between 2014 and 2018. Support for family carers balancing work with care is fast becoming a growing health, business, economic, and social issue. To continue with the issues in the literature review, employee leave entitlements were covered. So I examined carers leave, carers benefit legislation, which was brought into effect in 2001. Take-up of leave is low, and this is in line with European trends. The reasons for this: fear of negative consequences, loss of earnings, cost in terms of career progression, and loss of opportunities, lack of knowledge of the leave entitlement. What do our older people want? In a poll of 1,000 adults conducted on older people, when asked their preference to be cared for in their own home, 85% of them chose this option, which is a significantly high number. In a nursing home, 6%, and 9% said they didn't know. Weekly costs of caring for an older person in acute hospital is estimated at €6,000 per week. Significant economy cost savings from options other than hospitals or care homes. More progressive companies are now acknowledging elder care as equally important to childcare. And workplace policy formulation in Ireland would be very welcomed. So the findings: women between the ages of 36 and 55 years old are the predominant caregivers. 45 hours per week is the predominant amount of time spent caring. Sorry, that was referenced by 37% of the respondents. 41% of people said they were worse or substantially worse off due to care responsibility. 45% of people said that carers' leave would have negative impact on their career, in their opinion. Then on the policy awareness by employees, 45% were aware of carers' leave. Force majeure was known by most people, 65% of respondents, and parental leave at 50%. When asked whether their employee sick leave was paid or unpaid, almost half of the cohort, their sick leave was unpaid. And almost 65% of people surveyed were using sick leave in order to care. When asked about their probable return to work after an episode of caring had ended, 50% said they wished to return to work full-time. Sick and annual leave were widely used for caregiving episodes. There's a rigid carers' leave policy with very low uptake. So employer perceptions by carers in the workplace. This is particularly telling. Lack of flexibility, deficits in empathy and support, leave requests not given any priority or urgency. Employee assistance programs were cited as being not fit for purpose. Preferential treatment of parents' family care needs at work. 84% of employers were aware of caregivers in their workplace.
Just 2 minutes.
However, 72% of people felt unsupported after a period of care leave when returned to the workplace. So finally, the conclusions and recommendations here. So broken it into three: the caregivers, the employers, and the state. So for the caregiver, current supports are grossly inadequate to allow caregivers to live, work, and earn in a manner that's mentally, physically, and financially viable. Sick and annual leave are widely used for caregiving, which is equates to a loss of earnings and downtime. Improved access to information and supports would be welcomed. Carers' leave is not designed to cater for the majority of working carers. It's rigid in nature, in earnings, in hours allowed to work, in notice required, and in the 104-week timescale over an entire lifetime. The proposed 3 to 5 days could indeed be used for hospital appointments, collections, deliveries to and from medical facilities. For the employer, the 3 to 5 day care leave would indeed act as a retention tool, with increased attendance and decreased sick leave. Education of employers, employer bodies, state agencies, workforces on existence, scope, scale, and needs of caregivers in the workplace. A complete overhaul of existing employee assistance programs. Retention and respect would be gained from loyal and responsible workforce if these things were put into place. For the state, it would increase predominantly female numbers in employment during and after care events throughout their working lives. Agency collaboration in reskilling, upskilling, and support for return to work carers or indeed first-time entrants to the workforce. Provision of user-friendly access to information on all supports available for employees and employers, and to introduce a policy similar to parental to include all family caregivers in line with societal changes. Health service shortcomings would indeed be ameliorated through timely collections from hospitals, and shorter stays equals reduction in bed blockers. That concludes my research paper. I'd like to thank everybody for their interest and attendance today. As you can see on screen, I can be contacted by mail on the email address, or indeed by text if you wish. Thank you ever so much for your time.
Well, thanks a million, Michelle. We're just running up on the time there. Thanks. We'll share your slides on the website, and anybody with any follow-up questions can get in touch. We'll put those contact details up as well. Thanks a million.
Thank you.
So next up we have Ms. Caroline McGowan from Technical University in Dublin, and she will present to us the unreasonable expectations that DEIS schools can solve complex society problems, a progress report on a collaborative cross-curricular intervention around food and cooking in an inner city school. And whenever you're ready, Caroline, you can go ahead.
Thank you. So good afternoon. Thank you to everyone for organising this conference today and for the opportunity to share the work that I've been doing on this project. My name is Caroline McGowan. I'm a PhD candidate in TU Dublin, and the presentation today is Unreasonable Expectations that DEIS schools can solve complex societal problems. It's a progress report on a collaborative cross-curricular intervention around food and cooking in an inner city school. So today's presentation, I will cover the genesis of the research, the fieldwork and the expected outputs, the case study DEIS Band 1 school, a profile of the case study area, what DEIS schools are expected to deliver, designing an integrated curriculum module, COVID-19 school closures and calculated grades, unmasking the systemic unfairness of the school system. So this presentation reports on a collaborative intervention invited by the Parents' Council and the staff of an inner city DEIS Gael school to TU Dublin Colbrew Street doctoral programme. And the source of the funding for this research is Musgrave Marketplace alongside Acorn Independent Merchants. The main identified school needs were nutrition and food knowledge. However, additional requirements centred on a need for compensatory and cross-curricular pedagogical practices to achieve DEIS learning targets. So having a look at the fieldwork itself, it consisted of a single case study using collaborative inquiry methods with the principal and the class teacher to develop, number one, an EduCare integrated food and care programme with 2 food and cooking modules delivered to 4th, 5th and 6th class in 1 session per week. Care for some lunch, it's more than just food. A pilot hot food lunch experience every Friday for the whole children and the whole school. The third part was a food book, which was a collaborative project with the children, and also a pedagogical guide for teachers to replicate the module. So looking at the actual case study itself, so the school in question was Scoil Keeveen. It's located on Marlborough Street in Dublin 1. It is one of 2 primary schools in the St Mary's Pro-Cathedral Parish, the other being the Central Model School. Both schools are located in the campus of the Department of Education and Science. The original Irish medium school was established in 1927 and comprised of Scoil Mhuire agus Scoil Colmkill. However, they were both amalgamated into Scoil Keeveen in 1983. So it is a DEIS Band 1 designated school and draws pupils from the inner city Dublin 1 area. It operates at 3 teacher with principal of school and has enrolment figures of between 60 and 110, and teaching is through Irish. The model school then, on the other hand, has 276 pupils and teaching there is through English. So on this slide here, it's drawn up from Google Maps. The blue arrows you'll see here are pointing to primary schools in the area. At the centre here, you've got Scoil Keeveen and the Central Model School. What's interesting to note about this slide really is how few primary schools there really are in that area, despite the population size, and also the lack of green spaces. Moving on to the post-primary schools in the area, again, Google Maps with Scoil Keeveen in the centre there. There are a number of secondary schools, post-primary schools in the area. There are 4 DEIS post-primary schools and 1 private Belvedere College. Just behind Scoil Keeveen is Larkin Community College, and this is the nearest secondary school to Scoil Keeveen. It's a mixed school and a lot of the children actually attend this school. However, just to note that there are no post-primary Irish schools in the area. So in relation to the North Inner City in Dublin, there are a number of areas that merit discussion. However, I'll only go into a few aspects today, given the time requirements. So for this part of the presentation, I have used Pobble Maps just to draw up the area, looking at the HP deprivation index to illustrate the study area. So I just have highlighted Sculpey-Veen in the centre there, and the electorate districts that surround that. So you have Mountjoy A and B, Rotunda A and B, and the North Inner City. So this screenshot, you can see here the lighter areas, and I've just highlighted this in Mountjoy A to show that it's showing up as marginally above average. In this second screenshot, we see the same area, but at SAPS deprivation level. And again, I've highlighted the same area here, and it's showing that it's showing up as disadvantaged. So the calculation of deprivation scores on the basis of electoral district mask differences when calculated at SAPS level. I also just have a quick look at the next slide. It's educational attainment. So using Pobble general data to look at the percentage of primary only education in the same area at SAPS level, it shows also worrying statistics, as you can see the dark red areas here. Progression, here we see the progression to post-primary school education in the Republic of Ireland. You can see here that Dublin 1 is actually the third lowest after Dublin 10 and Dublin 17. So what can DEIS schools achieve? DEIS was introduced in 2007 to address the educational needs of children from disadvantaged communities ages 3 to 18. A prerequisite for inclusion in DEIS is the school's commitment to target setting for numeracy and English literacy, to monitoring progress and to measuring outcomes. So there are criteria by which disadvantage is measured, and the school is part of that process in which they provide data. Some of the advantages of DEIS, if we just have a quick look here, there's 20 in a junior class, 24 in a top class, but what's important to note here is that there's 26 supposed to be in a class in non-DEIS schools, so not really much of a difference. Administrative principles, access to school meals, access to numeracy and literacy support, access to homework clubs assisting literacy and numeracy, access to homeschool liaison services. So just because you have access to something doesn't actually mean that they have an actual right to it. So critical commentators point out the imbalance in DEIS. The weighting is more on maths, reading in English, writing in English. However, what's often not included is other requirements such as love and care, self-esteem and confidence, emotional intelligence, among other things. And what we know is that children from disadvantaged areas have an excess of problems such as economic inequality, food poverty, homelessness, which also creates a whole list of other problems. From a pedagogical point of view, children learn in contexts, and the spaces, places, and people they come in contact with have a deep influence on their development. At the moment, the NCCA are revising and redeveloping the primary school curriculum. That's happening for the first time in 20 years. And just to take a quote from that, the redeveloped primary curriculum will support schools in working towards the creation of inclusive learning environments, which teachers can interpret locally and which allow for variations in children's learning needs. The next slide will just show you exactly what the areas are within the primary curriculum at the moment, which many of you might be familiar with, such as arts, maths, social, environmental, scientific, social, personal and health, physical education, religious education, and primary languages. So for the research, in collaboration with the school, we looked at integrating the curriculum areas and to move away from a time and task paradigm to a compensatory paradigm. Now, I won't go into this slide in detail, but it represents the curriculum areas on the outside, and they're integrated into what the research is all about, this Educare integrated food and care program. So what it really is a combination of education and care based around a food and cooking module. So what the EduCare programme tries to do is compensate for these 4 domains of needs of primary school students, as indicated in the Homeworks Report 2018. So of most importance here, security, routine, friendship, trust and belonging, and self-esteem. And what's important to note here as the child grows, that these 2 areas are growing over time, and they become increasingly important, which is why that we need to look after children at a younger level as they're getting older.
Just 2 minutes there.
Thank you. The research I'm doing moves the homework study on by identifying a fifth domain of needs, and I've called that children's affective needs. So ultimately what we try to do in the programme is help them to build their self-esteem, self-confidence, modelling positive values, positive relationships, competency, social competencies and friendships. So all of these help to foster a child to feel belonged, mattered and counted. This is just a quick snapshot of the module in action, a few photos there. The next slide I'm going to quickly go into, we should be able to go online. This is the food book I created with the children. And it was an ebook, and I'll just give you a quick look at it online. So basically, the food book includes lessons that we did throughout the module. So it also contains some of the art of children, some of their own recipes, some of their own ideas. I'll just give you a quick look here. Some of their opinions, how they felt throughout the programme. Little artistic representation they had learned. And also some really important points here about food and care and how the children felt and things that they brought into their home also. So just getting back to the presentation then. At the current stage that I'm at the moment is the evaluation of the fieldwork. So the findings from the evaluations will be used together with the other elements below to inform a pedagogical guide for teachers. This will be useful for teachers in DEIS schools where similar interventions in local contexts could take place. Unexpected aspects along the way, obviously COVID lockdown, school closures, and more recently the discourses around standardised leaving certificate results and unmasking advantage and disadvantage entitlements in the education system. So we are now really beginning to measure the impact of school closures and COVID on children, as indicated in this study by ESRI study. And it's important to note that pre-COVID, 1 in 4 children were living in deprivation. So that's out of a class of 20 children, that's 5 children. Some of the quotes from the Irish Times during the year: school closures affect disadvantaged students much more severely. School leaders fear digital divide and will widen achievement gap. So the big questions rising from the research are DEIS schools a site of reproduction, agent of change, both or neither? And according to Lynch, educational institutions alone cannot eliminate social class inequalities, as the generative site of social class injustices rest on economic rather than educational relations. So according to the literature, it shows that in fact there is no real equality opportunity in schools. Some competing discourses very recently in the Sunday Independent 13th of September, for once the usual winners didn't take it all. On the other side, middle class students have been thrown under the bus. So on that note, I'll leave it with this. It seems that schools maintain the systems. After COVID, everything may go back to the usual system. Thank you so much for your time.
And thanks a million, Caroline. That was very informative. We've a minute and a half or so, so I'll jump in there with a question. I'm just wondering, we haven't had any specific presentations on the issue of housing, and you mentioned it there. And I mean, well, it's likely, or at least possible, that the current housing crisis might get worse with COVID, and especially affecting disadvantaged communities in and around cities as well. And we know about, anecdotally about stories of families in hotels, etc. So is this undermining the good hard work of DEIS schools? I mean, I know you say that's your thesis there, that obviously the schools can't it can't be relied on to fix all these problems, but has it come up in your research that is impacting the children?
Yes, well, of course, the issue of housing and children living in emergency accommodation, that's something that the school in particular would have dealt with. But as I've come across in research from other people as well, what schools can offer is that secure base to children, even if they are coming in and they are going from accommodation, emergency accommodation. What school can provide is that secure base, and anything that can give children that little lift, anything small, is very, very important. But in relation to, there is an issue as well with children who are living, I think, in emergency accommodation, where schools are finding it difficult to follow up on records, and that can really impinge on the children's educational requirements as well going forward. So there are a lot of different issues, but I think school can really help by doing small things to provide a secure base and to provide a social outlet for children.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks a million for that, and we'll add that to our website there for anybody who wants to follow up with Caroline. We'll put your email down there as well. Thanks a million.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so next up we have Dr. Michael McGann from Maynooth University, and the title of his presentation today is Double Activation and the Governance of Employment Services. And I'll just let you take it away there, Michael, whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. So can you all see that now? Okay, so I should say that this is really a conceptual paper, and what I want to do in this paper today, or this short presentation, is unpack some of the linkages between what I sort of would describe as two tracks of welfare reform in Ireland over the past 10 years or so. And so the first track is what you might call the activation turn in social policy. So the sort of intensification of job search conditionality and payment penalties and sanctions. And the second track that I'll focus on more today is the governance reforms of operational services that have also been introduced, particularly in the last 8 years or so. So these include the merging of benefit administration and public employment services with the Intrio reforms of 2012 or so. There's also been changes to how the community-run local employment services are procured. And particularly focused today for me is the introduction of the Job Path Payment by Results program from 2015. And Job Path is described as a quasi-market in employment services. So what does a quasi-market mean? It's because it's distinct. Quasi-markets in social or employment services are distinct from kind of conventional markets in several ways. One of the first and most significant being that there's only one purchaser, the government purchaser. Not all of the providers in the market are motivated by profit per se. So one of the job path providers, for instance, is a social enterprise, or at least describes itself as such. And then thirdly, that the clients are sort of, they don't directly purchase services, but the government purchases services on their behalf. But this kind of second track of governance reform is often treated in isolation from the substantive policy shifts. It's kind of seen as changes about how policies are delivered rather than what policies are delivered. And that sort of distinction between the how and the what of policy implementation is kind of contested by people that study the front activation or the street level bureaucracy research, who make the argument that the practical is political, in the sense that changing the organizational and professional contexts in which programs are implemented not only changes how they're implemented, but also might change what policies actually manifest and materialize at the ground level. And Ireland's experience of marketization following activation and work first sort of conditionality is far from unique. It's been replicated in many countries internationally, and there's quite a large body of research on this that has arisen over the past 20 years or so. Several scholars see it as marketization as being a way of smoothing the way for the implementation of more punitive or behavioral approaches to activation. And particular concern amongst countries like Denmark and the Netherlands is that privatization may be a way of marginalizing social workers from policy implementation. And there's suggestions in the US and other countries that private for-profit providers may be more motivated to apply behavioral tactics to clients than either public sector providers or not-for-profit providers. But I think that's a very contentious point, and research we've done in Australia certainly doesn't find that at all, and would sort of dispute that claim. But I think I want to unpack sort of deeper shared conceptual commitments between marketisation and activation. And the first of these is a commitment to commodifying claimants. So job search conditionality enforces an obligation to work and penalises non-employment. And that requires claimants to join the reserve army of labour and sell their labour in the labour market, so commodifies their labour. Quasi-markets do this in a different way, because what happens in quasi-markets when you competitively tender employment services is that you create lots of claimants that are bid on by potential providers who basically bid for the right to work with those clients and turn them into profit by refining their labor and selling them on to, by refining their human capital, building it and selling them on further to employers. And if you look at the kind of how the job path payments are constructed, about 90% of the potential payments that providers can earn are contingent on deriving employment outcomes with the clients. So the more efficiently providers can convert claimants into job placements, the greater profits they derive from the contract. So that's the commitment to commodification. But they also each kind of have a shared theory of agency or motivation. And Sharon Wright, who's a scholar from Glasgow, calls this a theory of bad agency. They both sort of diagnose a distrust of the willingness of both claimants and public sector workers to work reliably unless monitored and incentivized to do so. And particularly the welfare conditionality is underpinned by a kind of pathological theory of unemployment that some scholars, like Charles Murray from the US in particular, thinks that claimants choose welfare over work because the wages aren't high enough at the periphery of the labour market and benefits are too high. So they're kind of acting out of rational self-interest to remain on benefits. So the solution is to cut payments to incentivise transitions to the labour force. The marketisation of public employment services is also part of a wider reform agenda in the public sector known as New Public Management. And that's driven by public choice economics and principal agent theory, which challenges older ideas about public sector workers being altruistic, knights in the words of Julian Legrand, and kind of public spirited in their orientation, and instead recasts them as knaves who are motivated by rational self-interest. And what this sort of challenge to conventional public administration theory entails is that we can't trust public sector workers to pursue public policy goals or the common good, because they're actually motivated to grow their salaries, grow their reputation, grow their prestige. And policy failures can be explained away by the fact that that the implementation incentives aren't allied or reconciled with the self-interest of the people delivering them, and contractualizing the relationships between the principal and the agents through performance incentives, payment by results, is seen as a way of kind of aligning public sector workers' self-interests with public policy goals and steering through a form of what's called governing at a distance. Now, what I want to just quickly touch upon is a series of kind of inbuilt tensions with this kind of way of trying to govern policy implementation, policy delivery. And people talk about this as a form of double activation because you're using performance incentives and contractual relationships as a way of kind of activating public implementation workers. So one of these inbuilt tensions is in the area of service investment. It's a tension between asking providers to compete on price and the sort of quality of employment services that may be subsequently delivered as a result. And particularly when you have payment by results or outcome-based contracting, there can be an inherent status quo bias because risky innovations aren't rewarded or necessarily unless they deliver outcomes and results. So there's a very much a risk associated with that, which can disincentivize agencies to pursue that. Longer term investments in kind of holistic or integrated approaches, and we've heard talk earlier today about the need for some of those, can be hampered by the short time horizon of contracts, and particularly in the context of allowing agencies to compete on price during tendering processes, where they offer discounts on the sustainment payments that they might receive in contracts. That can siphon out quality in advance, and it's one of the reasons why countries that have pursued this a long time ago, such as Australia, have actually gone away from price competition and competitive tendering. A particular concern is the impact that outcomes-based contracting has on the profile of frontline workers, and particularly trends towards deprofessionalization, de-skilling of the frontline workforce. There's also another set of tensions around payment by results versus access to services on an equitable basis. And for job seekers, there's a danger that providers may narrowly target their services on those clients who are closer to employment, who they perceive as more lucrative, and that they may underservice people who require more intensive assistance because they're not convinced, or they're less sure that they can actually achieve sustained employment outcomes with those core cohorts. And that's a classic problem of what's called creaming and parking. For providers itself, outcomes-based contracting and payment by results has a risk of potentially excluding smaller not-for-profit providers from the market because of their inability to wear the level of financial risk in contracts, and because they basically have to fund service delivery and service investment up front.
There's 2 minutes there.
2 more minutes, great, I'm coming towards the end. And this can lead overall to the danger of the market consolidating around small group of insider firms who target their services on the proportion of their clients who are easier to help. And I'm making these sort of claims or about the tensions, drawing on research that's been done in Europe by Fleming Larsen and his colleagues in Denmark, and also by colleagues that I've been involved with work in Australia, based on 20 years of contracting out there. I don't have time to go into this in detail, but just to pick up that point about de-skilling and standardization of frontline workforce, there's been 20 years of survey research done on the frontline workforce in Australia. And what this research tends to show is that there's been quite a lot of de-skilling of the frontline workforce, and that service delivery has become more routinized and more standardized over the 20 years of contracting out in Australia, and not more flexible as the kind of quasi-market theory would presume. However, having said that, Ireland is a very different context. We have a very different political culture. Our quasi-market is less competitive than other countries. We have more state regulation of the quasi-market. There's more specification of minimum servicing standards and so forth. So we can't assume that the kind of patterns that we've seen internationally elsewhere and in other countries will be replicated here in Australia, in Ireland, especially as we're a small state as well. And it's only very recently that we've sort of turned towards a work-first model. So I've just really, at the end here, setting out a series of research questions for exploring what the impact of marketisation is in the Irish context. And it's a particularly great context to explore these research questions, because we've got a proportion of services delivered by for-profit agencies on a payment by results basis. And we have services of organisations working in the local employment services that's on a cost met basis. So to what extent do the service delivery models and practices of providers commissioned via outcomes-based contracting differ from those of the public provider, that's Intrio, and the community sector providers, that's the local employment services? Do we see differences in the kind of profile of staff, their age, occupational background, and the perceptions and attitudes of staff towards clients, and differences in work first versus human capital development orientation towards providers? So I'll leave it at there because I'm running out of time.
Now, my God, so we have about 2 minutes there for a bit of Q&A. So what do you think? Obviously, the big issues now, everything, we have to think about how it relates to the new labour market with COVID. So what do you think are the big challenges now or the implications of your research now that the world has changed in the last 6 months or so?
Well, yeah, so it's certainly a very pertinent question and time to be exploring questions around this. I guess one of the things that we've seen in this 6 months, 9 months or so is a massive increase in the claimant count. And we're going to have a very stretched public employment services capacity. And one of the reasons that we sort of turned towards marketisation after the last crisis is that there was enormous constraint on the public Employment Service, and that we needed to actually boost the capacity to deliver public employment services, and we simply didn't have that in the public sector. So we had to contract private providers to add additional capacity to the system. We've kind of in a dilemma at the moment because the current contracts with JobPath and with the local employment services are going to expire at the end of this year. And the Labour Market Advisory Council has recommended extending those contracts at least for an initial 2-year period, because we're going to expect a surge in long-term unemployment come March of next year. And I'm certainly not saying that there is no role at all for a quasi-market in employment services or for private providers in the system. I absolutely do think there is a role. I'm just sort of identifying some tensions that we know that are associated with this kind of way of trying to implement employment services and activation services that we need to unpack and test and find evidence about in the Irish context to see if we are mitigating some of the concerns that we've observed elsewhere in other countries, or have we actually managed to design our quasi-market and employment services in a way to kind of safeguard against some of these risks of standardization, of de-skilling, of deprofessionalization.
Okay, very good. All right, thanks a million for your contribution, Michael. We'll again we'll put the slides up on the website on your contact details for any follow-up questions for that very interesting research. Okay, so we're moving on. We're doing okay for time. Next up is Dermot Coates from IGEES and the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, and obviously a very important presentation, a topic today. It's on COVID-19, the welfare state and activation policy, and I'm sure we'll build on some of the stuff we've been just talking about now in the last couple of presentations. All right, so are you there, Dermot? Are you there? Can you hear me, Dermot?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you're coming through there now.
Very good.
Okay. So whenever you're ready, we can see your screen there anyway, and whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much to the organisers for inviting us along today, and welcome again to all of the other participants and observers. My name is Dr. Dermot Coates, and I'm Chief Economist with the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. So I think for the next 10-15 minutes, I'll just walk you through the impact of COVID-19 with regard to the welfare state and the updating or redesign of activation policy, and specifically looking at the expanded footprint of the welfare state given the unprecedented increase in the volume of clients served by the state.
There, yeah.
Can I get my slides to move? Okay, so firstly then look in terms of that expanding the footprint of the public employment service and the welfare state more generally. So if we think back to where we were at the end of 2019, the unemployment rate was moving towards 4.5%, or what is more typically understood as the natural rate of unemployment. And we'd seen unemployment fall in a succession of quarters on an annual basis. But clearly the situation has disimproved very, very significantly in the 9 months since. So if we can see here with the onset of the pandemic, there's quite an adverse shock to the economy. And by April, the COVID-19 adjusted unemployment rate, so that's the parallel series produced by the CSO colleagues as the upper band, had jumped to 28.2%. And clearly in that period, the department and alongside other government departments and state agencies moved to introduce a range of additional income supports to support displaced workers. So again, by April, we would have seen approximately 1.1 million people in receipt of those supports. So that would be spanning job seekers via the live register, the pandemic unemployment payment, or the temporary wage subsidy scheme. So you can see from the chart there, by the time we get into early May, the number of people on the PUP alone had reached just 600,000 people at that point. So again, a very rapid deterioration in the situation. And research that would have been published as a working paper on the initial impacts of COVID-19 under the auspices of the Labour Market Advisory Council found that the sectors most impacted would have been hospitality and food services, retail and accommodation, and that by and large people working in those sectors tended to be younger, to be low skilled, working part-time employment than the average population more generally. So again, that we can see the people who are most impacted. But as the situation unspooled over successive weeks, we've seen the underlying composition change, particularly with the shutdown, the broader shutdown come the end of March, where we would have seen the construction sector closed as a result of those public health measures. But then if we just expand that timeline up to more recently and look at the impacts of reopening, you can see the figures for the PUP had fallen actually quite quickly, but those falls are really anchored around the reopening phases that we would have progressed through up to early July, maybe middle of July. So you can see actually the number of people on PUP fell from 600,000 down to about 300,000 within maybe week 2 or 3 of the third reopening phase. The numbers have continued to fall in more recent weeks, and I think we're down to around 210, 215,000 people on PUP, but the week-on-week reductions are actually very, very small in more recent weeks. But we do see that there's an increase in the number of people on live register as people regularise their claims, and there has been a sustained throughput of people onto what would have been the TWSS up until the end of August, or now the EWSS. And once you drill into that data, you can also see there's quite a few people who are moving into entirely unsubsidised employment, that there still is a functioning labour market below the surface. But clearly this has been an entirely unanticipated and unprecedented shock. As I said, that figure of 1.1 million people come April in receipt of supports, and there are still very significant numbers of people reliant on state supports that wouldn't have done so heretofore. And again, that feeds through that increased footprint for the welfare state. And then just very quickly to look at the impact by sectors, you can see there, if we look at the proportion of employment supported by the state, either directly or indirectly, 3 sectors still stand out, which has been accommodation, wholesale and construction. Particularly with the case of construction though, the peak numbers would have been about 80,000. That has fallen to about 15,000 now, and actually the proportion of people who are self-employed has also fallen, okay? So, you know, you can really see there's been a push for people to return to work as some of those measures are being eased and the underlying payments have been reformed. But that said, there are still very significant numbers of people in receipt of direct or indirect state supports, and in some sectors, the state is carrying a very high proportion of the workforce still in situ and are being supported thus. But the supports being paid out are not simply wage subsidies or income supports. There's been you know, a very large throughput in number of people actually in receipt of the enhanced illness benefits, which is shown the figures there, and clearly the peak cohort being those 35 to 44 years of age. And that would include quite a portion of people who are claiming the payment whilst being tested or quarantined. But again, there's multiple strands, and I'm just representing some of those schemes there to give you an idea of the extent to which the burden carried by the state through the welfare services has increased rapidly in response to what has happened. But that said, the entire system is dynamic, and certainly it is not static as it looks to respond to those changes. So as was noted by an earlier speaker, a Labour Market Advisory Council was put in place at the start of the year and was very much tasked as its first role to develop proposals around rebooting the labour market, and those would have been on foot of COVID-19 and in the aftermath, and those were published in June. So some of the issues then looked at there were enhanced employer incentives and subsidies, reforming the existing short-time work supports, programs around upskilling and reskilling, funded work placement models, and as was also mentioned, the issue around looking again and expanding and extending the contracted public employment service proposals in order to provide additional capacity for the task and challenge that faces us. And a very important part of the broader policy framework within which we're working is pathways to work. So as many be aware, that's the National Employment Services Strategy. We're coming towards the end of the previous iteration, which covered the period 2016 to 2020. So we are due and are on track to produce the next iteration of Pathways to Work. So again, continue the goal of ensuring many jobs as possible. The goal to do is providing in receipt of supports from the Public Employment Service and improving better labour market outcomes for all. But we need to align this with the July job stimulus, the National Economic Plan and the next budgetary cycle. And I would mention again with the July job stimulus, you can kind of see the system work here in that the Labour Market Advisory Council policy paper would have produced a number of proposals. Those fed directly into the July job stimulus and in turn will feed through to Pathways to Work. So it's very much a linked in programme of public policy development rather than being atomised with different proposals being brought forward by different agencies. And just very quickly then, as I come towards the end of the time, just to touch on the idea of activation and the role of the Public Employment Service in a world of COVID or post-COVID. So again, clearly the model of engagement needs to be adapted and we need to be able to respond to that changing model. So during the course of the particular COVID-19, in that environment, the provision of employment supports has to be adaptable then to meet demand. So what you would have seen in the pre-COVID-19 world, a job seeker would meet face-to-face with a case officer, but clearly work is underway to utilize and deploying new models of service delivery, and that work is ongoing. But again, that will need to augment the existing approach to face-to-face by bringing in online models, or adapting to that more the virtual world for service delivery, to see how we can do that and deliver high quality services to people, so they're aware that the intro public employment service is still available to people, but that it is sufficiently adaptive and flexible to respond to those changing circumstances. And again, always cognizant of the fact we need to comply with social distancing requirements and those public health guidelines. But again, in developing and then ultimately deploying that digital engagement model, there are factors we need to be aware of, and that's the capacity to explore the development and implementation of different channels, so that we continue to meet customers their needs and circumstances, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So then it's a case of blended service provision, so that could include multi-channel marketing and use of. Yeah, thanks very much. That's technologies that we're confident will work, and reliable backup supports. But again, we also need to be cognizant of the fact there are potential issues associated with that, such as broadband access is clearly still an issue for people in some part of the country, and certainly not equal availability across the country, and issues to do with digital literacy levels for certain customers. So again, it can't be a one-size-fits-all approach, but equally we cannot act as if COVID-19 has not happened and we can revert to the old models of service delivery. And we need that sufficient capacity with the public employment service, whether delivered through intro or related agencies, to actually provide sufficient capacity so we can meet those needs that will face the service. And I have included some additional material in the annex if people would like to have a look at that, but I don't propose to go through any further slides, but I am happy to take any questions you might have.
Thanks a million for that. That's a great presentation, very important, obviously. We just a theme that seems to have been coming up there, just in terms of the effectiveness of some of these active labour market policies in the current context, and whether there's a demand problem, whether there's a demand side problem in terms of the demand for jobs at all, and if this strategy is as effective, say in an environment of crisis as we're in at the moment, relative to approaching full employment at the start of this year.
Well, there's certainly there's a dual way of thinking about this. In the first instance, the demand for labour is very much a derived demand. You need a functioning economy with customers out there and business that need workers in order to be able to take people off some of these state supports. So it's clearly very important that the various departments and the state enterprise agencies can help a lot of those businesses to reboot and go back to doing business in a socially distanced manner, and one that is safe, but that there is actually a demand for labour. But equally, it's important that for the customers who would approach the public employment service in any guise, that we're clear about the absorptive capacity of some of the sectors, because clearly some sectors have had a very significant shock, and some will take a period to recover, and their capacity to absorb past workers is something that we'd have to be very cautious and monitor, because it cannot be the case that all sectors will simply rehire all those displaced from said sector in March. And there is a need to look at things like further education and training and work placements to try to help people to go back to work. But one issue that's always important to bear in mind is, and very unfortunate, we typically see that periods of recession tend to act as accelerants for underlying trends. And my suspicion would be some sectors, including retail, this has acted as an accelerant towards moving away from the high street, and the extent to which people will revert to prior behaviour post a vaccine and go back to physical shopping, therefore the demand for workers on the scale that might have been there, just to take that sector as an example. I mean, those are underlying trends we do need to be conscious of. But equally, there are opportunities there as well, because as we're all aware, new lines of business and ways of doing work are coming on stream that wouldn't have existed previously, and they will provide a demand for work, in some sectors or lines of business that we couldn't even conceive of now. So that's a long answer to a short question, but
no, it was very good. Thanks a million. I think we've covered there very good, and thanks a million for that presentation, Dermot Coates from IGEES, and we'll put your slides up there with the rest of them as well, and any follow-up questions we'll put Dermot's contact details on the NERI website. Thanks a million, and we'll move on to our last one of the day. is Dr. Adele Whelan from the ESRI. She will present to us the findings of a joint paper with Dr. Judith Delaney, Dr. Seamus, McGuinness, and Dr. Emer Smyth, and its evaluation of SICAP pre-employment supports. So thanks a million.
Thanks very much, Karen. So the presentation today is on the evaluation of SICAP pre-employment supports. And just a brief introduction to what SICAP is, the programme. It's administered by PUBL and it's funded by the DRCD, so the Department of Rural and Community Development. They provide funding to tackle poverty, social exclusion and long-term unemployment, predominantly through local engagement and partnerships with disadvantaged individuals, community organisations and public sector agencies. We're specifically looking in this evaluation at pre-employment supports. So we focus on individuals who are receiving employment assistance who are deemed to be furthest from the labour market. So there's two criteria here. One is they're very long-term unemployed, so that's unemployed for 2 years or more. And they also have low levels of educational attainment. So that's leaving certificate or less. As we spoke about in numerous other presentations today, or the sharp rise in total unemployment at the start of this year due to COVID-19. And we expect the total number experiencing long-term unemployment to rise into the future. We know that those who remain outside paid employment for long durations, they face a unique array of disadvantages and numerous barriers to entry into the labour market. And they often require quite specific assistance to be considered employment ready. It's very, very difficult to get access to data for individuals who are accessing pre-employment interventions first and foremost. And even when it is available at an international level, finding a comparable control group to compare those individuals to estimate a counterfactual is very difficult. This was a unique situation where PUBL has data, administrative data held by PUBL, allowed us to conduct a counterfactual evaluation. And they had information on the interventions that individuals received. They also had information around the complex and their diverse range of needs, so their unique barriers that they faced. And we know individuals who have slower progression into employment quite often have these extra needs. We knew from the outset that a quantitative approach alone would not be sufficient. So we had 3 phases for the analysis. The first was we used the data to create a detailed profile of the participants. So this allowed us to examine key attributes for the participants, whether that be individual characteristics, the barriers that they face, and also we had some information around spatial factors. The second stage then, informed by the first, was a standard counterfactual analysis. So we compared the employment outcomes for individuals after 3 and 6 months. So we compared a treatment and a control group within the IRIS database, and we used propensity score matching to estimate the treatment impact. And that allowed us to eradicate any potential differences in the observables between the individuals that were the data related to. The third stage then was qualitative analysis, again informed by the other 2 stages. It included a postal survey, email postal survey of all the local development companies. So they were the providers within the service. And we identified 5 case study areas for further analysis, where we conducted in-depth interviews with the LDC CEOs, the staff working with participants current and past, local employers in the area and other key policy stakeholders. So to give you an idea of the data, a brief overview of the data. Within 2018, SICAP worked with approximately 32,000 individuals across a range of goals. We identified a treated group, so individuals who are very long-term unemployed, 2 years or more, with low levels of education, who were availing of employment supports. So you can see there either employment or self-employment supports predominantly. Then we also identified a group of similar individuals, so low levels of educational attainment, very long-term unemployed, who are receiving other interventions such as personal development, well-being, and lifelong learning opportunities. We had roughly 2,000 individuals in both our control and treated samples. When we looked at the profile of participants, what we found was of all SICAP participants, so 30,000 individuals, those who we had identified as pre-employment, they were considerably less likely to move into employment and self-employment. So these were a uniquely disadvantaged group. They were 11% less likely to move into employment and 5% less likely to move into self-employment than the other SICAP participants. Then focusing on the pre-employment sample, our treatment and control group, what we found is the progression was found to be lower into employment and self-employment for females, lone parents, older participants, those over 55, those living in more disadvantaged areas reporting a disability, ethnic minority, and or who reported having a transport barrier. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the conclusions of the entire study. First and foremost, we found a positive counterfactual impact on employment. A very positive finding around the progression rates into employment. When we compared to a similar group of control individuals, those who had participated were 18 percentage points more likely to progress into any employment, 8 percentage points more likely to progress into employment only, and 30 percentage points more likely to progress into self-employment. We found the effects to persist after 6 months, and we looked at the driving factors also, and we found that they were driven predominantly by the one-to-one employment interventions rather than group supports or courses, although they did play a role, but predominantly the one-to-one employment interventions. The reports around motivation and confidence that they had developed as a result of the supports, and also the supportive relationship with staff was seen as crucial. When I talk about one-to-one supports, there was a range of tailored activities. So these were one-to-one meetings in a room on average of about 40 minutes duration with a staff member and one of the beneficiaries. They included encouragement, mentorship, job search assistance, CV preparation, also assistance in making phone calls, filling out job applications, also redirecting individuals for further assistance in the area of literacy, mental health, and any other assistance that they may need to overcome the practical barriers that the individuals face themselves to assist them into employment. One thing to say was the contact was maintained over a significant period. So individuals were supported to engage with and remain on courses, the transition through interview stage into employment, and it appeared to be ongoing. The courses that were also recorded within the data, they were often seen as supporting the one-to-one support. Particular ones that were mentioned was workshops on issues such as tax returns or social media for those moving into self-employment. Then courses were also designed to enhance personal development or attitudinal skills, particularly for this target group. And there was some high interest courses also developed by the LDCs. One in particular to mention was driver theory courses, and they were used to attract younger members who may not be in education, employment, or training. Lastly, to say some challenges that were reported. The LDCs, they play a key role in providing connection to local services, from what I've said there, but the provision of other employment services such as the LES or Jobs Plus, other different programs available at LDC level, they appear to shape the kinds of employment supports that were offered to individuals. They also, the staff highlighted the lack of mental health and psychological services available locally and reported this as being a serious problem. There was also a variation in the level of contact with employers. So while employment was very locally needs-based, there was variation in the strength of contact with employers overall. Also, the LDCs who had a caseload facing multiple barriers or greater barriers, they had more difficulty and had greater challenges with engaging with the local employers. So there was a greater scope to strengthen the links with employers for many of the LDCs. To briefly give an overview of the implications for policy then, so in the context that we've spoken about high unemployment rates, around 17%, the long-term unemployed and those economically inactive, they are increasingly made up of individuals who face such multiple barriers. And the LDCs, they highlighted the lack of self-confidence alongside these more challenging issues such as poor mental health, substance abuse and homelessness among the target group being the key issues. Also in rural areas, the costs of transport was seen as a persistent barrier, not only to engaging with employment and sustaining employment, but with engaging in education and training also. The SICAP supports, they certainly appeared, so they sit within a broader suite of employment supports, but they certainly appeared to have a distinctive place within this context for a number of reasons. One was they offered a flexible, personalized support for both individuals and small groups. They had a holistic approach, community development-based approach.
Just 2 minutes there, Adele.
No problem, thanks, Kieran. So it was voluntary in nature of engagement. It's important to say that. So it wasn't compulsory for the participants to participate within this program. It was voluntary in that nature. And also the LDCs, they had a niche in terms of self-employment supports. So the approach that was taken by LDCs was seen by stakeholders and the other beneficiaries to be especially important when dealing with individuals most distanced from the labour market, individuals that we're speaking about that we've classified as pre-employment. Outreach was successful for some LDCs, but there was potential for further engagement to engage in further outreach projects to be extended further. And also one thing that we feel would be of unique importance in terms of evaluation of such programs is extended tracking of individuals accessing SICAP employment supports and other employment supports, ideally optimized through linking of official and administrative data sets and to really evaluate more long-term impacts, especially in terms of self-employment supports also. So the full report was published early in September. It's available on the ESRI website. I'll leave a link there to that. And also a longer presentation, including more detail around the evaluation, is also available. And I've included the author's emails and details here, should anybody have any further questions after today. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a million, Adele. That was great. We have a few minutes there now. I've two questions there actually. Obviously, we'll start with the first one. Was there any breakdown of the kind of nature of the employment that people went into in terms of sectors or occupations? And the second one again is, we obviously keep coming back to it, is the issues around COVID, and particularly you mentioned one-to-one sit downs and you know, the access to technology and a broadband laptops, and also travel restrictions. So obviously the public transport is even less accessible than it might have been a couple of months ago for a lot of these individuals. So what do you think what do you think the challenges are then for these kind of programs going ahead in the next 12 months are?
Okay, so in terms of the jobs that people got, within the data we did have some information, but unfortunately it wasn't very well completed. What was there, we could see that the jobs and the sectors were, firstly to talk about the jobs, they were mainly part-time, temporary contracts around the minimum wage. Sectors, the information that we had was around healthcare and sales, construction. These were the main sectors that were completed. But as I said, it wasn't collected in any detail that we could report within the study, but that was what we had. And then in terms of expansion of in current climate, given the rise of unemployment for COVID-19, what we know is many of these individuals, they are not very long-term employed. Their educational, the makeup of the individuals who have been recently made unemployed is quite different. So the composition is different. But for the individuals that we're talking about, they would certainly face barriers in terms of computer literacy, numeracy. It would be uniquely challenging in terms of accessing, using digital software. So that is something that would need to be thought about. Access into broadband, transport also, as you say, is not as good as it was even nowadays in terms of COVID-19. So there's a few additional challenges, I think, is what we're saying here towards what was already there.
Okay, that's brilliant. Very good. Thanks a million, Adele. And I'd like to, I'm wrapping up now. We're only a few minutes over, which is good going for 20 odd presentations today. So Paul, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just to thank everyone, to thank our presenters during this session and every other session we've had today. Things have run comparatively smoothly, which is a lot to say for an online event. So I just invite everyone here to rejoin us tomorrow for the opening plenary tomorrow that starts at 9:20 tomorrow morning, and that's with Mr. Sean O'Connor, PAYE Modernisation, investigating the opportunities for enhancing and developing new statistical insights. That's about the launch of a new data set, I understand, that's been very looked forward to, at least in policy circles. There's been a slight change to the programme tomorrow. We'll be finishing a little earlier than you can see on the current iteration of our programme. One of our presenters, unfortunately, has come down ill, which happens particularly in the current context. And please watch our Twitter and Facebook. We might be sharing links to some of these sessions as they progress, so you can forward those to other people who might want to participate tomorrow. So with that, thank you everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I'll shut down the thank you.